as a point of reference, the tribe of Asher, you have the 12 tribes, you have the 2 in the southern kingdom, which were Judah and Benjamin, right? And then you had the 10 tribes in the northern part of the kingdom that Assyrians took control over around 800 BC. And so they were under that control. They were considered the 10 lost tribes of Israel because of it. So the Assyrians take control over it, and so the tribe of Asher was in that area that was under Assyrian control. And so, people, if they were going to continue to follow the God of the Bible, they would have to do it kind of on their own, because this was not something that was the common of the people who were in power and control. They had to really make great efforts to not allow everything that was going on around them to completely pull them away from their God. And so clearly there were some people that, although were under that control, they were able to pass along, and what a testament, not only to Penuel, but just even his parents and going further, because along the way they passed enough down that Anna was really committed to God. So she was part of one of these tribes. What's significant about this as well is that most of the prophets and judges that we read about and know in the scriptures are usually from one of the other tribes, many of them from the southern, Judah and Benjamin. There's not a whole lot of folks that you see mentioned as prophets or judges that were from this tribe of Asher. So she was special. She was really, really special. We also learned that it says she was very old and she was a widow. Now, if you look back historically, they say typically around that time people lived 40 to 50 years old. So if she was 84, you get why someone would say she was very old. And so she had been around a long time. She had seen a lot. She had experienced a lot. She clearly had experienced grieving because she was also a widow. We know this from the passage as well. She was also a widow. She knew the grief of losing a husband and the pain that that would bring to her heart. And being a widow in that time, just socially speaking, was extremely difficult. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But this is kind of what we know about Anna if we really consider her circumstances. And so when we read this passage, we've got to understand this is where she came from. This is the context in which she was in. And there's so much that you could even get just from that alone. But I want to talk about 3 things that we see that she does that I believe we would be wise to imitate when we're in that process of change, when we're not yet there, but on the way and are waiting on God. And I want to talk about 3 things. The first thing I want to talk about is wait. If you're thinking about what do I need to do, I know this doesn't sound flashy, I know this isn't super exciting, but you got to wait on God. God is working, but you got to wait on him. If you consider how long she waited to see what she got to see, and we'll talk about that in a second, but considering in first century culture you could be married as a teenager, in fact that's how the age that most were married, and that she was married for 7 years before her husband died, it means that she was probably a widow for over 60 years. 60 years. Now, 60 years is a long time. But I don't know that we really appreciate what 60 years looks like for a widow in the first century. It would have been a difficult wait. I would say this was an extraordinary wait. And yet you see something revealed in her character. One of the reasons it was an extraordinary wait is because who she was in a first century context. Number one, she was a woman. That was not something that was looked highly on in first century. In fact, perhaps you've heard this before, but there's a well-known and often repeated rabbinical prayer of praise that involves thanking God for not making him a Gentile, a woman, or an ignorant man. That was the context in which Anna was living. That was the context in which Anna was waiting. Simply being a woman meant she was looked down upon. Second factor that made it an extraordinary wait was she was a widow. See, widows were amongst the most vulnerable in society at that time. See, they would not have had a means to take care of themselves. They were seen as very vulnerable. Like, this is the group that you see. In fact, we see later on in the Bible, it gives instructions about making sure that we're taking care of widows. You see this in the scriptures. This was something that as Christians were called to because they were amongst the most vulnerable people group at that time. So she's a woman and she's a widow. A widow, unless she remarried, she would simply have to rely on the goodness of others, or in reality, the providence of God. That's how she had to live. Unless she remarried, she would just have to wait and trust that somehow, some way, God would surround her with people to help her. See, when she was waiting 60 years. She was also, one of the other factors, she was from the tribe of Asher. And as I mentioned before, this was not the tribe that commanded attention. That people would say, oh, well, yeah, tribe of Asher, these are the great. No, that wouldn't have been the reaction she would have received, even if they could get past the fact that she was a woman and a widow. That's not something that would have worked in her favor. And yet, she was a prophetess. It's interesting, in the actual Greek, NIV now translates it prophet, but it's the feminine noun. She was a prophetess. So God chose to communicate through her. And so this was something, God chose the most vulnerable, chose someone that perhaps would not be paid much attention to, not taken seriously. God chose her to communicate with. Anna would have waited a really long time to see what God would have communicated with her. She would have had to be committed to that wait. See, Anna would have waited over 60 years as one of the most overlooked and undervalued people in society at that time. See, we complain if we wait on God a day for a prayer. We complain a week, a month. We complain about our circumstances, what we don't have. And yet you see Anna, 60 years, waiting under less than ideal circumstances. And yet, you see a faithfulness that's hard to find. She waited over 60 years to see what God has promised. A second thing we see is worship. See, what's interesting about this passage, at first I want to mention it talks about worshiping, and it talks about she never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Now this is totally loaded. I just want to camp out on this for a second. Number one, fasting and praying is being described here as almost an act of worship. And why wouldn't it be? You're connecting with God. You're praying to Him. I think too many times we limit worship to what we do on Sunday morning. Romans 12 says, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. This is your spiritual act of worship. So not only were you worshiping on Monday by praying and fasting, you're worshiping every time you offer your body as a living sacrifice to God. See, worship cannot be a Sunday morning thing. Worship is a way of life thing. That's what we see in people who are totally committed and faithful to their God. And then Sunday, what that Sunday ends up being, it's a culmination, it's a celebration of how you've been worshiping all week long with your God and to your God. You know, we can look at this, and clearly, I think it's safe to assume she was not literally there all day long and she never left. I think it's safe to assume she had to eat, you know, she had to do things. I'm sure there were times, but think about the statement that it says about who she was. That their perception of her was, she doesn't ever leave. That's what she was known for. The perception of her was, she worships day and night. She never leaves the temple. This was the perception that people had of her. I wanted to ask you a question. What do people know you for? Let's be real. What do they know you for? I mean, when you read this passage, it's convicting. There's people that, and let's remember the context here. Any man in that time would look to degrade who she was and what she was about. That was the society of the time. And yet, what they could say of her is, man, she never left the temple. And she just prayed and fasted and worshiped the Lord all day. This is what the writer says, Luke, of her. This is clearly what people would have said about him. You know, Luke wanted to report what was happening, what was going on, and yet we see this incredible example of someone worshiping in a way that made people feel like, man, she just never leaves the temple. And you know, what's amazing about this is that this, you know, she would go to the temple, and again, you had levels where only women could go and men could go, but here she is, she's there every day, praying and fasting, and people saw that and they said, man, she must never leave this place. And I think, you know, for myself, what am I known for? You know, this is like when I think about this, I think of a legacy issue. Like, what do I want to be known for? What am I known for? What do I want to be known for? I mean, the testament to her life that this is what she was known for is convicting. It's especially convicting in light of the fact that she had a lot of reasons to be bitter. A lot of reasons. The treatment that she received, no doubt. Being a widow. Maybe she had some incredible dreams to be with her husband, and then 7 years later, she had reason to be bitter. Let's be real here. But clearly, she just was going to the temple. She was going to the praying. This was part of her life. You know, when you see this pattern, when I read it, you know, now obviously, I can't even count how many times I've read the book of Luke. And this whole narrative never really stood out to me because I never dug deeper into the background, tribe of Asher and all this kind of stuff. But even the idea that she was praying and fasting, and that seemed to be just a regular part of her life. Again, why does it stand out? Because we're talking about prayer and fasting. See, this is what happens sometimes. Sometimes when we seek to hone in and focus on what God is actually saying, we actually hear what he's actually saying. See, but when we're not focused, we can read stuff like that and just zoom over it like an airplane going over a field. We won't even pay any mind to it. But when you're focused and you're thinking about it, prayer and fast, boom, wow, this is what she did. This is a regular part of her life. We see an upward call when we see Anna. We see an example of someone who waited on God. We see an example of someone who worshiped God. And we as Christians would do well to imitate her in this. You find yourself on the way to change. You find yourself waiting on God. Just think, wait. Think worship, and ultimately think win. Now, let me just say this up front. The word that I wanted to use is victory because God provides the victory. But win just goes so much better with wait and worship. Okay, you got me. All right, there we go. But it's all the same. It'll be easier for you to remember. I'm doing you a favor. You know, what we see here is that God ultimately rewarded her waiting and her worship. We see that when Jesus comes and is being presented, that she realizes who he is. She got to see the Jesus that was promised. She was one of the first people on this planet ever to recognize who he was. She recognized it before he started doing miracles, before everyone was paying attention, simply when he was a baby. It was Simeon, her, bam, Anna. She was rewarded. She gained a victory because she waited and she worshiped her God. You know, we have to really make sure as Christians we define what a win really looks like. See, a win doesn't mean I get everything I want. A win isn't everything turns out great and I never have a day of suffering. That's not a win because she won. She suffered. She waited. She didn't get things when she wanted. But man, when that delivery came, can you imagine The joy in her heart. You see what happens with the joy in her heart. She goes on and starts telling everybody, hey, this is him. That's a natural reaction to when God delivers, and it's like, you know what, I waited a long time, but this is right on time. See, a win with God is God working for your good. That's how I would define it. The reason is because sometimes God is always working. He's always working for your good. It might not always feel good. It might not be in a good situation, but yet God is still working for your good. A win is when you get to experience God working for your good. And I'm not saying experience in the fact that it's happening. It's happening. I'm saying when you get to experience because you see it, because you're so focused on him, it's impossible to miss. See, but if you get tired and you get bitter, you stop waiting, guess what? You won't see the victory. It might still happen even. But because you stopped waiting and gave into bitterness, you miss it out. You won't see it. Because you'll be so focused on what you don't have, you'll be so focused on your circumstances that you miss out on a great miracle. I mean, think about it. These scriptures, everyone had access to them. People had access to read. They had been learning about this stuff since they were little kids, and yet when Jesus came, they didn't even know he was there. She knew because she waited and she worshiped. So then she won. You know, you had religious leaders that knew all kinds of stuff, had all kinds of, understandings. They had rules. They understood. They were the respected people in the community. Everybody looked at them. They were the teachers of the law, and they didn't have a clue that Jesus was right there in front of them. But she knew. The one that's overlooked and undervalued, she knew. She knew exactly who was in front. See, sometimes we could be around God, we could be around the things of God, but because we're not really focused on God, we miss what God is doing altogether. We miss the whole point. We get caught up on minute details that will have no bearing on whether you make it to heaven or not. No bearing. One of the things that I've been thinking about as well is that, and this is for the parents, there were parents along the way that contributed, that maybe Anna never even met, that contributed to that moment that she got to experience seeing Jesus and knowing who he was. As parents, we have to be careful that we don't overvalue education, sports, and all the other hoopla that's out there. I'm not saying don't encourage your kids to do that stuff. I'm saying if the most important thing is not God, you're tripping. You are totally missing the point. If Jesus came back, he does not care what school they went to and what kind of degree they got. And I tell you, sometimes you got kids, that's all they focus on, they do it on their own, but sometimes the parents are overvaluing things that don't matter if Jesus came back. See, she had great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents that along the way said, this is important, and I don't care what's going on around us. My kids and my kids' kids and my kids' kids after that, they will know about our God. As parents, is that your conviction? Do you really share that conviction? Don't look around and start blaming the church for where your kids are not. It starts in the home. It will always start in the home. It's not the teen workers' fault. Just look in the mirror. We got to make sure we're giving our kids everything we got. And here's the thing. You might give them everything, and they still might not choose. But don't let it be because you taught them to overvalue things that at the end of the day will not matter. May that never be said of us. And the last thing I want to share about this is that Anna had a natural reaction to when you see God do something that just completely blows you away. What you don't see in this passage, you don't see the apostles, mansplaining what she should do next. You don't see that. What you see is this Anna the prophetess, out of gratitude, that's all she had. Gratitude. No Bible talk leader had to challenge her. No life group leader had to challenge her. It wasn't about everybody else. All it was about was, I am grateful to see this Jesus, and I'm going to tell everybody about him. This is what it looks like when you really see Jesus. So if you're struggling with sharing your faith, if you're struggling with letting people know about who God is, are you really grateful? You might want to start there. Because a natural reaction to gratitude for who God is to start telling everybody about him. It knocks out all the fear. It knocks out all the trepidation, because you realize, man, it's always about my Jesus. He always shows up. Always takes care of me. He's the answer. See, when you're grateful, nobody has to tell you anything. She knew. She knew because she had a lifetime of waiting. She had a lifetime of worship. And man, she got a victory that very few people could ever say they got. She knew who he was before anybody knew, or just a few people knew. She knew. She saw the baby Jesus before he raised anyone from the dead, before he healed the sickness, before everybody started to see all the miracles. He knew. She knew who he was. I think this is an upward call for all of us. You waiting on God? Join the club. We all are. I want to encourage you, wait on him. Worship him. And he will provide the win. Thank you guys, and God bless.